She was 6 years old, silent since her mother's death. He was a fighting dog, bleeding and broken. She carried him across 2 miles of wilderness and changed everything. What if I told you a child who hadn't spoken in 8 months whispered her first words to a dying dog? Welcome to Hero Paws, where every story reveals a quiet power connection, even between the most unlikely souls. Today's story is not just heartwarming, it's unforgettable. It begins with a trail of blood on a dusty road and ends with a courtroom, a town transformed, and a dog who learned how to trust again. This is a tale of survival, sacrifice, and the kind of bond that rewires what we believe about love, loss, and second chances. Don't blink, don't skip, because every scene brings you closer to a truth that might just stay with you long after credits roll. Watch till the end. The lesson is waiting there. The trail of blood was the first thing that caught Bill Henderson's eye that evening. A dotted line of dark crimson against a sun-baked dirt road, winding like a question no one had asked. It wasn't unusual to see the occasional deer stumble into traffic outside Riverdale, especially come spring, when young bucks wandered too close to the road. But this blood was different. It was fresher, thicker, and it led from the tree line straight toward town. Bill eased his truck to the shoulder and squinted through the windshield. The sky above the sapphire mountains was painted in soft gold, the kind of light that made everything look gentler than it really was. But there was nothing gentle about the figure he saw coming toward him. A tiny girl, no more than 6 years old, staggering beneath a heavy, matted weight. It was a dog, a massive German shepherd, half her size at least, draped limply across her narrow shoulders. His fur was soaked in blood. One of his front legs dangled at a wrong angle. His muzzle was swollen and torn. And yet, somehow, the girl was carrying him, step by trembling step, her arms locked under his paws, her bare knees scratched and dust-covered. She wasn't crying. She wasn't calling for help. She just kept walking, lips moving soundlessly until Bill opened his door and stepped out into the gravel. "Sweet Jesus," he breathed. "Sophie." The little girl looked up at him, pale, dirt-streaked, her blonde hair plastered her forehead with sweat. She blinked but didn't speak. "Not yet." She shifted the dog's weight slightly and took another step forward. Bill hurried toward her, his boots crunching across the road. "What happened, sweetheart?" "What?" That's when he heard her. Quiet at first, barely a whisper, like wind slipping between trees. "Hold on, Rex," she said. 3 words. That was all. But to Bill Henderson, it was everything. Because Sophie Miller hadn't spoken since her mother's funeral 8 months ago. Riverdale, Montana, was the kind of town that made people believe in simpler times. Nestled between Blackwood Forest and the Sapphire Peaks, it had 1 gas station, 2 diners, and a church with bell that still rang every Sunday at 9. The streets were wide and quiet. People still waved to strangers, and the local hardware store hadn't changed hands since the Reagan administration. It was the kind of place where everyone knew Sophie Miller, or thought they did. She'd been the town's bright-eyed question machine, always full of chatter and wonder. The kind of child who talked to wildflowers and gave names to squirrels. But something had changed on the day her mother's car skidded off Mountain Pass Road. Abigail Miller, a reporter for the local paper, had been driving home late from the office. Rain was falling. The roads were slick. The official report said she'd swerved to avoid a deer. Her car had gone over the guardrail, down into the ravine. The impact had killed her instantly. Sophie, buckled into her booster seat in the back, had survived. But from that day forward, she said nothing, not to her Uncle Frank, who took her in, not to her teacher, not even to Pastor Jim, who gently invited her to speak every Sunday after service. Bill lifted the dog carefully from Sophie's shoulders as she collapsed to her knees, still holding onto the animal's massive head, like it was the only thing anchoring her to the ground. "He needs help," she said, her voice breaking now. "They made him fight." The dog's eyes, clouded with pain but still alert, never left the little girl's face. Bill didn't understand it. Not yet, but the moment stayed with him. That image, a bloody German shepherd cradled in the arms of a silent child who had just found her voice again. Frank Miller had been fishing when the call came. He was standing knee-deep in Crescent Creek, sorting the morning's catch when his phone buzzed and Martha Wilson's name lit the screen. "Frank," she said without preamble. "Sophie brought me a dog." Frank furrowed his brow. "A stray. She carried him," Martha said, "across the forest. 2 miles, maybe more. He's torn to pieces, Frank. And she's talking." Frank didn't speak. He just stared at the rushing water, as if it might explain any of this. "I thought you want to come." "I'm on my way," he said. By the time Frank arrived at Martha's veterinary clinic, the sun had dipped below the trees. The faded blue awning fluttered in the breeze, and the closed sign had been turned half-heartedly to open. Inside, the smell of antiseptic and hay lingered. He found Sophie sitting on the floor, cradling the injured dog's head in her lap. Her shirt was stained with blood. Her small fingers traced a path through the shepherd's fur, gentle as moonlight. Frank's heart ached at the sight of her. 8 months, and not one word, not one smile. And now this. "Sophie," he said softly. She looked up at him. "This is Rex," she said. And in that moment, Frank knew the name wasn't just a label. It was a declaration. Later, Martha would say it was a miracle of pure stubbornness, that a child so small could carry a dog so large, that she had crossed a swollen creek, climbed a ridge trail, made it down dusty back roads in the heat of a spring afternoon with nothing but a pink backpack, a juice box, and a heart full of something too deep for most adults to name. Frank watched her from the doorway, hands resting on the frame. His niece, his sister's only child, was no longer just surviving. She was doing something. For the first time since Abigail's death, Sophie had chosen to act. And the dog? He wasn't growling, wasn't flinching. He just watched her, trusted her. And Frank, a man who'd spent 20 years in law enforcement, knew what trust like that meant. Even a broken dog could feel it, when someone saw you not as a threat, but as something worth saving. That night, Frank sat beside Sophie on the porch steps as she ate soup from a thermos. Rex slept just beyond the screen door, his breathing slow but steady. "Where did you find him?" Frank asked gently. She didn't look up. "In the woods," she said, "under the blackberry thicket. He was bleeding. He tried to get up, but he couldn't." Frank waited. "I gave him water and a bandage. And I told him," she hesitated. "Told him what?" "That I would help, if he helped a little, too." Frank swallowed. The sun was gone now, and the stars had come out, faint and cold. "He's lucky you found him," he said. "No," Sophie whispered, resting her head on his shoulder. "I'm lucky." And in that moment, quiet as it was, Frank Miller understood something that police training, grief, and years of silence hadn't taught him. Sometimes the ones we save us right back. The meadow was quiet that morning. The kind of quiet that feels earned, not the hollow stillness of loss, but the kind that settles in after spring rain, when the soil is damp and everything waits for the sun to rise just a little higher. Sophie Miller stood barefoot in the wet grass, gathering wildflowers into a mason jar. Purple coneflowers, black-eyed Susans, the soft yellow buds of arrowleaf balsam root. Her stuffed dog, Buddy, sat propped against the jar, serving as silent supervisor, just as he always had. She didn't speak, not to the butterflies, not to the flowers, not to the clouds drifting slow over the sapphire mountains in the distance. For 8 months now, Sophie had let silence live beside her, like an invisible sister she didn't ask for, who followed her from room to room. Since the day her mother died, words had felt like splinters, sharp and too hard to hold. But this morning, something stirred. A breeze, maybe, or the way the light angled through the trees like a doorway cracked open. She looked toward the edge of the meadow, where the grass thin and the forest reached out with its cool shadows. Her uncle had told her, "Stay in the field, Soph. Don't go into the woods." And she meant to obey. But then she heard it. Not a bird, not wind. A whimper, soft, shaky, like someone trying not to cry. Sophie turned, scanning the tree line. The sound came again, from behind a cluster of blackberry thickets, thick with thorns and early green fruit. She hesitated. Then, without a word, she picked up Buddy, cradled him to her chest, and stepped off the path. The forest floor was damp beneath her feet. Ferns brushed against her shins. She pushed aside brambles and crawled beneath low-hanging branches until she reached the source of the sound. There, tucked in the shadows under the thicket, lay a dog. No, not just a dog. The biggest dog she'd ever seen. A German shepherd, coat matted with dried blood, breathing in shallow gulps. His eyes were open, amber eyes, and they were looking at her, not with anger, not with fear, but with something that looked tired. They stared at each other for a long moment. The dog didn't move. Sophie didn't either. Then the dog tried to stand. A sharp cry escaped his muzzle as he collapsed, one front leg bent at an unnatural angle. His body twitched with pain. His tail didn't move. Without thinking, Sophie crawled forward on her hands and knees. She stopped just short of him, reached out a small, scratched hand. "It's okay," she whispered. The words came uninvited, foreign and stiff in her throat, like muscles that hadn't been used in a long time. The dog's ears twitched. His eyes locked on hers. But he didn't growl, didn't pull away. Instead, he lay still. Sophie reached into her backpack. Uncle Frank always made her carry the little first aid kit. She'd never used it before. But now her hands, though trembling, moved with purpose. She pulled out a bottle of water and poured a few drops into her palm, holding it out. The dog's tongue, dry and pale, lapped weakly at her hand. "You're hurt bad," she said quietly, "but I can help." She dabbed gently at the worst of the cuts on his side with the corner of her shirt, then pressed a bandage against one that wouldn't stop bleeding. The dog flinched but didn't bite. He just watched her, like he was waiting. She didn't know how long she sat there. Time didn't work the same when you were in the woods, when everything smelled like pine and rain and old earth. But as the sun climbed, Sophie knew one thing. This dog wouldn't survive without help. She looked down at his body. His ribs showed through his fur. One ear was torn. His paws were raw. His chest rose and fell in quick, unsteady bursts. He couldn't walk. Not like this. And Uncle Frank wouldn't be back from Crescent Creek for hours. Sophie looked at him. Really looked. "You need Dr. Martha," she said. The dog blinked. She bit her lip, thinking hard. Then she stood. "I'll carry you." She didn't say it like a child dreaming the impossible. She said it like a promise. It took her 3 tries to lift him. The first time, she staggered and fell, scraping her elbow on a rock. The second time, she managed to get his front paws over one shoulder, but they both toppled sideways into the dirt. The third time, she planted her feet, like she'd seen weightlifters do on TV, took a breath, gritted her teeth, and stood. The dog, heavy as a sack of wet grain, hung across her back, legs draped over each shoulder. His weight nearly crushed her, but Sophie didn't stop. "Just a little," she told him. "You have to help. Just a little." And then she walked. The first quarter mile was agony. Her legs shook. Her back ached. Every step felt like dragging a mountain uphill. Twice she dropped to her knees. Twice she got back up. "My mama said," she whispered through clenched teeth, "Miller women don't quit." The dog didn't whimper, didn't squirm. He let her carry him. And Sophie, she let him remind her of something she didn't know she still had. Strength. They reached the creek just before noon. Usually it was just a trickle, but spring rain had made it wide and fast. Sophie stood at the bank, eyes scanning for a path. To go around would take too long. To go through, risky. She looked over her shoulder at the dog. He looked back. "We can do this," she said. She stepped onto a stone, then another. The weight on her back shifted dangerously. Halfway across, her foot slipped. They teetered. Then the dog tensed. Sophie felt it, a sudden counterbalance, just enough to keep them from falling. She gasped, caught her breath. "Thank you," she whispered. They made it to the other side. When Sophie saw the curve of creek road up ahead, dusty and sunlit, her knees nearly gave out. The house was still almost a mile away, but it was visible now. "Just a little farther," she said. The words came between gasps. Her throat was dry, her arms numb, but she kept walking. That's when she heard the sound of a truck, then tires skidding in gravel, then a voice. "Sophie." She looked up. Bill Henderson. He ran toward her, eyes wide. The dog slipped from her shoulders as Bill reached for him. Sophie collapsed to the ground, exhausted, but she didn't let go of the dog's head. "Please," she said, "help him." Bill stared at her, at the dog, then back at her. "What's his name?" he asked gently. The girl looked up, her face smeared with dirt and sweat and something like fire in her eyes. "His name is Rex," she said clearly, and he didn't want to fight. And that's when Bill knew this wasn't just a dog. This was a story, a bond, a rescue, a reckoning. And somehow, against every odd, it had begun with a little girl, walking out of the woods with Silence behind her and a broken soul on her back. The screen door creaked on its hinges as Bill Henderson stepped into Martha Wilson's veterinary clinic, carrying a wounded dog that shouldn't have made it past the woods. Sophie Miller walked in behind him, her face streaked with dirt and quiet defiance. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She simply placed one hand on the blood-matted fur of the German shepherd and stood very still, like a sapling bending but never breaking. Martha was already pulling on gloves when she saw them. At 62, she'd stitched up cattle after bear attacks, calved britches at 3 a.m., and once resuscitated a newborn goat with nothing but sugar water and stubbornness. She thought she'd seen it all. But this stopped her cold. Sophie Miller, speaking, and the dog in her lap, broken, bleeding, one leg clearly shattered, lying still, his amber eyes locked on hers like she was the only truth left in the world. "He needs help," Sophie said simply. Just that. But in Riverdale, that sentence landed like thunder. Frank Miller pulled into the clinic's gravel lot not long after. His old pickup growled to a stop beneath the faded blue awning. He didn't even close the truck door behind him, just hurried up the steps with a heart that hadn't stopped pounding since Martha's call. Inside, he found Sophie on the floor of the treatment room, knees drawn up, shoulders hunched, her hand resting gently on the uninjured side of the dog's neck. Frank's breath caught. "Sophie," he said softly. She looked up at him, really looked. Her eyes, so long cast in gray, now held something steady, alive. She reached for his hand. "I found him, Uncle Frank," she said. "He needs our help." Frank dropped to his knees beside her, the floor cool against his palms. It had been 8 months since she'd said his name. 8 months of bedtime stories read into silence, of dinners eaten in wordless routine, of nightmares she couldn't describe and he couldn't chase away. And now, here she was, not just speaking, choosing to speak. Martha worked quietly, her trained hands moving over Rex's body. The dog didn't flinch, didn't growl. He watched Sophie the way the dying watched the sky, like it might save them. "His leg's broken," she murmured. "Bad. And these lacerations," she shook her head. "Some are old, some are fresh." Frank's lawman instincts kicked in. Fighting wounds. Martha nodded grimly. "Yeah, these weren't from a fall. They're patterned, repetitive, like from other dogs." She didn't say it outright. Didn't have to. Dog fighting. Even in quiet towns like Riverdale, it whispered at the edges, behind barns and back lots, 10 miles deep into the pines. No one ever saw it, but some suspected. Everyone looked the other way. Not this time. As they worked, the bell above the front door jingled, a sharp, unexpected sound. Calvin Reed stepped inside. Frank stood up straight. Calvin was a tall man with broad shoulders, a square jaw, and a politician's smile. He ran the hardware store on Main Street, head deacon at First Baptist, chair of the Chamber of Commerce, a man who shook hands with intention and remembered birthdays. "Evening, Martha," he said. "Your lights were still on. Thought I'd check in." Martha wiped her hands on a towel. "Everything's fine, Calvin." Calvin's eyes scanned the room and landed on the dog. "Well," he said slowly, "what do we have here?" Sophie straightened, shielding Rex with her body. "He's mine," she said. "His name is Rex." Calvin blinked, startled to hear her voice. Frank saw the flash of something sharp flicker behind the man's polite expression. Surprise, maybe, or recognition. "Well, I'll be," Calvin said. "You've been quiet for a long time, Sophie." She didn't respond. He looks pretty rough, Calvin added. Studying the dog. You sure he's safe to be around? He ran away from them, Sophie said. Her voice was small, but fierce. He didn't want to fight. They made him. Frank narrowed his eyes. Calvin's interest wasn't the interest of a man worried for a child. It was possession, calculation. Calvin excused himself a moment later, saying he had to get home before dark. But Frank watched him walk out to his truck and pause by the driver's door, pulling out his phone. He wasn't smiling anymore. By morning, the whole town knew that Sophie Miller, the silent girl, had spoken again, that she carried a dog twice her size through the forest and across a flooded creek, that the dog bore the unmistakable marks of abuse, and yet somehow had shown no aggression, and that Frank Miller, retired sheriff, was considering letting the dog stay. The opinions came fast. Are you out of your mind, Frank? Harold Jenkins barked over coffee at the diner. That dog could turn on her in a second. He's got more loyalty than some folks I know. Mabel Lewis snapped from behind the counter. He couldn't even stand, and he still tried to protect that girl. Once a fighter, always a fighter, muttered someone else. You can't fix what's been broken. Frank listened, sipped his coffee, said nothing, but the words curled around him like smoke. He'd seen a lot during his time in uniform, knew the odds. Dogs used for fighting didn't usually come back from it, not in body and not in mind. But this one had walked through fire, and when he collapsed in the forest, the only thing that kept him moving was a little girl with a backpack full of bandages and enough stubbornness to crack stone. At the clinic, Sophie refused to leave Rex's side. She sat cross-legged beside his kennel, reading aloud from a book about horses. Her voice was still soft, but steady. Whenever she looked at him, Rex's tail thumped against the floor. Martha watched in quiet awe. He understands her, she said. Frank nodded. More than that, Martha added, I think he trusts her. She moved to adjust Rex's foreline. The dog didn't flinch. His eyes stayed on Sophie. I've seen animals come back from a lot, Martha said. But this is something different. Frank glanced at his niece, her fingers lightly resting on Rex's shoulder, the sunlight casting gold across her hair. It's not just him, he said. She's changing, too. Outside, the weather was warming. Spring finally settling into the valley after a stubborn winter. But in Riverdale, something deeper had thawed, something that lived in the spaces between people. In the things not said, the secrets not faced. For years, folks had heard rumors about dogfights out in Blackwood Forest, heard trucks rumbling down gravel roads at night, seen dogs vanish. But no one had ever found proof. Now a little girl had dragged it to their doorstep, wrapped in fur, bleeding and still breathing. And she was speaking again. The town didn't know what to do with that. Some were afraid. Some were angry. Some, quietly, were changed. That evening, as Frank walked Sophie to the truck, she paused by the porch steps. Uncle Frank? She asked. Yeah, honey. He's coming home with us, right? Frank looked at her, at the small shoulders that had carried so much, at the dog who had started to heal not just in body, but in heart, at the pieces of his sister's strength, blooming now in her daughter. He took a long breath. Yes, he said, but slowly. We'll take it one day at a time. Sophie nodded, the weight of his words resting easily on her. I'll help him, she said, with the bad memories. Frank felt his throat tighten. I believe you, Soph, he said. I really do. And as they drove away from the clinic, the sun dipped behind the trees, casting long, golden shadows down the quiet street of the town that was finally beginning to listen. The wind moved strangely that morning. It didn't howl or whistle, but shifted through the trees like a warning, rattling leaves that hadn't stirred in weeks. The kind of breeze that animals feel before humans do, the kind that makes deer lift their heads and birds grow quiet. At the edge of the Miller property, Sophie sat on the back porch with Rex's head in her lap. His bandages were fresh, his breath steady. He still limped, but he was healing. So was she. They spent most mornings like this now, in the hush before the world began, before the phone rang or trucks rumbled down the gravel road. Sophie would read aloud, her voice halting but strong, and Rex would listen, his eyes half closed, as if every word stitched something back together inside him. It had become their ritual, their peace, until the knock. 3 short raps on the front door. Sharp, out of place. Mrs. Peterson, the retired neighbor who watched Sophie while Frank ran errands, looked up from her crossword. Expecting anyone? Sophie shook her head. The knock came again. Mrs. Peterson stood, smoothing her sweater. Must be someone from church, she muttered, and moved toward the door. But Rex was already standing. He rose slowly but deliberately, muscles tense beneath his healing wounds. His ears pricked forward. Then he growled. Low, deep, ancient. Sophie had never heard that sound from him before. Easy, boy, she whispered. But he didn't relax. He moved between her and the door, shoulders squared, eyes locked on the front entrance. Something wasn't right. Mrs. Peterson pulled back the curtain and frowned. A man stood on the porch in a navy windbreaker, with a patch on the sleeve. Short hair, clean shave, animal control, he said when she cracked the door. Got a report of an aggressive dog at this address. I need to do a welfare check. Mrs. Peterson's frown deepened. Aggressive? That's ridiculous. He's wounded. That little girl rescued him. I'll need to see the animal. Do you have ID? He hesitated just long enough, then smiled. I can grab it from the truck, if you'd like. Mrs. Peterson hesitated. Something about the way he said that. Too calm. Too practiced. Sophie had crept back into the kitchen by then, listening. Her heart thudded in her chest. And then she heard his voice. A flash of memory. Shouting in the woods, that night under the blackberry thicket. The voice yelling at the dogs, urging them to fight harder. It was him. She grabbed Rex's collar with one hand and her backpack with the other. Come on, she whispered. They slipped through the kitchen door and into the woods behind the house, where the trees knew them, where Sophie had always felt safe. This time, she wasn't sure. The forest in spring is not always kind. The ground was soft with melt, and brambles grabbed at Sophie's legs as she pushed forward. Rex moved beside her, slower now but alert. Every sound made his ears twitch. Every crunch behind them made her stomach twist. They hadn't gone far when they heard it, an engine revving up the driveway, door slamming, voices. She ran. She won't get far. Reed wants the dog back. Alive. What about the kid? Just keep her out of the way. We're not kidnappers. Sophie froze. Reed. Calvin Reed. The man from the hardware store. The man who smiled too easily. The one who'd stare at Rex like he wasn't a dog, but property. He was behind this. He'd sent them. And he wanted Rex back, not to save him, but because he'd lost something valuable. Sophie felt the blood drain from her face. She gripped Rex's collar tighter. They needed to disappear. The forest thickened near Crescent Creek. The trail turned muddy, then vanished entirely. But Sophie knew these woods. Uncle Frank had taken her here every Sunday since she came to live with him. It was where they fished, where they found deer prints in the snow, where they'd once seen a fox trotting proudly with a rabbit in its mouth. She knew where to go. The old hunting cabin, just 2 miles uphill. No one else knew about it. They crossed a creek where the water ran shallow, Sophie helping Rex navigate the stones. He slipped once, yelped, but kept moving. He didn't look back. Neither did she. The cabin appeared like a secret revealed, half hidden behind a fallen pine, its roof sagging, but still standing. Sophie pushed open the creaking door and led Rex inside. She collapsed onto the dusty floorboards, chest heaving. Rex sank beside her, sides rising and falling like bellows. Outside, the forest held its breath. They were safe. For now. It didn't last long. Sophie had just opened a granola bar when she heard footsteps outside. Careful, slow, crunching leaves in the way only someone trying not to be heard ever did. She froze. Then the door creaked open, and there he was, Calvin Reed. No jacket now, just a button-down shirt, sleeves rolled, a leash dangled from one hand. His eyes were cold, calculated. Well, hello there, he said smoothly. You've had quite the adventure, haven't you? Sophie backed away, placing herself between Rex and the door. "He's not yours," she said. Calvin chuckled. "I'm afraid he is, sweetheart. I paid good money for that dog." "He didn't want to fight," Sophie said, her voice shaking. "You made him." Calvin's smile thinned. "That's not how it works." He stepped forward. "Don't," Sophie said. He didn't stop. Rex stood, growling again. Even wounded, he placed himself in front of Sophie, hackles raised. "That dog is worth $5,000, Calvin snapped. "And I'm not leaving without him." He lunged, and then the rifle shot cracked through the trees. Bark exploded from the wall above Calvin's head. "Touch my niece," Frank's voice rang out, "and the next one won't miss." Frank stepped through the doorway, rifle leveled, eyes hard. Calvin froze. "This is a misunderstanding, Frank," he said quickly. "The dog's dangerous. I was trying to protect the girl." Frank didn't blink. Funny way of showing it. Sending men to impersonate animal control. Chasing a child through the woods. Calvin's mask slipped. "You don't know what you're getting into," he hissed. "This goes bigger than you think." "I think I understand just fine," Frank replied. "You're running fights. You stole a police dog. And I think you had something to do with my sister's death." Calvin's eyes narrowed. Abigail should have minded her own business. The words landed like a slap. Frank's finger twitched on the trigger. Sophie's voice broke the silence. "Uncle Frank," she whispered, "there are more men coming." Shouts echoed through the trees. Frank's jaw tightened. Calvin smiled. "Seems we're at an impasse," he said. "You can't shoot us all." "No," came a new voice from behind. Sheriff Dave Taylor stepped out of the shadows, flanked by deputies. "But we can arrest you." As the cuffs clicked around Calvin's wrists, Sophie sank to the ground beside Rex. "You're safe now," she whispered. Rex leaned into her, his body trembling with the aftershocks of instinct, of protection, of loyalty that ran deeper than training. Frank watched them, child and dog, and felt something in his chest unclench. But his hands were still shaking, because now he knew Abigail hadn't died in an accident. She'd been silenced, and the people who'd done it weren't done yet. But neither was he. The air inside Martha Wilson's clinic was still and sterile, humming faintly with electricity and old grief. The lights were too bright. The linoleum smelled of antiseptic and dog shampoo. And on the stainless steel table at the center of it all lay Rex, unmoving, unconscious, hooked to a web of wires and tubes that blinked and beeped without rhythm. Martha stood over him, hands steady, jaw clenched in practiced silence. She'd worked past midnight, her small team assisting as she cleaned, stitched, stabilized, and prayed in a language only women who'd lived through enough loss truly understood. Frank sat in the waiting room. Sophie curled against his chest, her shoes muddy, her eyelids heavy, but still resisting sleep. Sheriff Dave had taken Calvin Reed and his men into custody hours earlier. Deputies had swarmed the logging camp by lantern light. By morning, arrests would be made, evidence gathered, papers filed. But here, in the tiny clinic nestled between a diner and a hardware store, this was the battlefield that mattered, because Rex was dying, and nobody wanted to say it aloud. "He's septic," Martha had told Frank quietly. The wounds reopened during the escape, and the creek water introduced bacteria. His body's fighting a full-blown infection. Frank had nodded, as if understanding changed anything. Sophie had just whispered, "But you can fix him, right?" And Martha, strong, unfaltering Martha, had looked away before answering. "I'm doing everything I can." Now, the monitors ticked on in steady indifference. A slow beep, a blinking light, a quiet gasp of machine-breathed air. Sophie had refused to leave Rex's side, even when the vet techs had cautioned the sight might be too much. She had seen blood before, had heard bones break, had held pain in her arms and carried it across the forest. None of this frightened her anymore. She climbed onto the step stool beside the operating table and placed her small hand gently on Rex's ear, the uninjured one. "Hey," she whispered. "It's me?" The dog didn't stir. "Rex, I know you're tired. I know it hurts. But not this time, okay?" Her voice cracked, but she pushed on. This time you have to fight for something different. Not like before. Not because they made you. This time it's you. A tear fell onto her hand, warm and silent. I carried you, remember? She whispered. Now it's your turn. In the hallway, Frank leaned against the doorframe, watching her. This girl who had once been too broken to speak, now standing guard like a warrior beside a dying friend. He thought about Abigail, how she used to scribble notes at the kitchen table while Sophie played with crayons beside her, how she believed that stories could save lives if someone just had the courage to write them down. And now her daughter was living one. A story of blood, silence, and grace. Hours passed like that. The machines kept humming. The fluids dripped. The antibiotics worked their way into Rex's bloodstream, waging a war too small for human eyes to see. Sophie never left his side. She read to him in a whisper. Chapters from her horse book, the one her mother used to read at bedtime. She told him about the cabin, about Buddy the stuffed dog, about the first time she saw snow. And sometimes she just held his paw and said nothing at all. Sometimes silence spoke best. At 4:17 a.m., something changed. Martha, dozing in a chair nearby, sat upright. Frank rubbed his eyes. Sophie perked up. The heart monitor had smoothed, just slightly, but enough. The erratic spikes of a struggling system now steadied, a slow, tentative rhythm, like a heart remembering its purpose. Then Rex's ear twitched. Just once. Sophie leaned in. Did you hear me? No answer, but his tail moved, the faintest thump against the metal table. Martha blinked hard. I don't believe it, she murmured. Frank stepped closer. What does it mean? It means, she said cautiously, he's not gone yet. She checked the 4, tapped the monitor, adjusted the oxygen tube. Sophie was crying now, but she didn't hide it. She let the tears come, one after another, sliding down her cheeks and soaking the fur beneath her fingers. I knew you'd stay, she whispered. By sunrise, the news had reached the station. Rex was alive, barely, but alive. Sheriff Dave stopped by with warm coffee and a trembling smile. I've seen dogs bounce back, he told Frank, but this one, he's something else. Frank nodded, staring through the glass into the treatment room. He shouldn't be here, he said. And yet, Dave replied, he is. They both looked at Sophie. She had finally fallen asleep, her head resting against Rex's shoulder, the machine's quiet rhythm breathing peace into the room. Later that morning, Frank sat alone on the front steps of the clinic. The sun was rising over the trees, casting long gold fingers across Main Street. He held a photo in his hands. Abigail, smiling, wind in her hair, one arm slung around a much younger Sophie. I wish you could see her now, he whispered. She didn't just find a dog, he added. She found herself. The door behind him creaked. Martha stepped out, carrying a worn clipboard in her exhausted heart. He's stabilizing, she said. No guarantees. But for now, he's fighting. Frank didn't respond right away. Then he said softly, she told him to. Martha nodded. Funny thing, she said, sometimes we think we're rescuing them, but sometimes they're the ones who carry us back. Inside the room, the machines kept doing their quiet work. The girl and the dog slept side by side. 2 survivors, bound by nothing but trust and a truth few others would ever understand. That love, the quiet kind, the stubborn kind, was the only thing that had ever kept anything alive. The storm didn't come with thunder. It came with paper, with court warrants, FBI jackets, quiet nods from men in plain clothes. It came with padlocks on warehouse doors, cardboard boxes of evidence, and cameras flashing outside a veterinary clinic in a town that had long considered itself too quiet for headlines. It came with silence, the kind that settles over a place when people realize the story they whispered about was true all along. And it started with a little girl and a dog. Rex was healing, slowly. He still limped when he walked, his gait uneven, his ribs visible beneath fur that had begun to grow back in patches. But his eyes were bright again, focused, the kind of eyes that followed Sophie's every movement like a compass fixed to its true north. Sophie rarely left his side. Each morning, she'd bring her schoolwork into the treatment room, kneeling beside his bed with a pencil in one hand and her other hand resting lightly on his back. Her voice, once locked behind 8 months of silence, now carried gently through the clinic, reading aloud, telling stories, remembering how to be a child. And the town, Riverdale, was listening. Frank stood at the front window of the veterinary clinic, coffee gone cold in his hands, watching 2 unfamiliar SUVs park across the street. The men who stepped out didn't look like locals. They wore plain coats, sharp eyes, and the kind of calm that only came with federal authority. FBI, Martha confirmed as she joined him at the window. They're here about the dogs. And about Abigail. Frank said nothing, just watched as the agents crossed Main Street and stepped through the door of Calvin Reed's hardware store, their badges flashing silver in the morning sun. Later that day, in Martha's office, Special Agent Lauren Parker opened a thin folder and set it gently on the desk. "We executed search warrants on Mr. Reed's personal property," she said calmly. "We found a false wall behind his office safe." Frank sat still, jaw tight. "In it," she continued, "we recovered a ledger of financial transactions, payouts, names, venues, some dating back almost 5 years. She flipped open the folder, revealing columns of handwritten notes, photographs, deposit slips. And then a name, Abigail Miller. Frank's stomach twisted. Agent Parker met his eyes. She had photographs, detailed notes. She was working on an exposé. From what we can piece together, she'd already confronted someone, likely Reed himself. The timeline matches. "She never told me," Frank whispered. "She told no one," Parker replied gently, "except her notebook. They found it, too, tucked inside the false wall, wrapped in a dish towel, as if even hidden things deserved comfort." She connected the dots, Parker said. The missing police dogs, the rise in cash gambling, the land out in Blackwood Forest. "She was going to blow it open," Frank said softly. Parker nodded, and they knew it. Outside, Riverdale was beginning to stir. A story had broken, not all at once, but piece by piece, on front porches, in the pews at First Baptist, between sips of coffee at the diner. The whispers that once protected secrets now pulled them out into the light. "Did you hear? They found 3 more dogs at Calvin's property. The girl? She carried him across the forest. Said his name was Rex. Frank's sister, Abigail, they say her death was an accident. It was murder, and the dog might have helped prove it. The town didn't riot. Riverdale wasn't that kind of place. But people change in quieter ways." The church bulletin included a notice for a fundraiser to support animal rehabilitation. Volunteers showed up at the shelter on Saturday with blankets and food. Mabel Lewis baked 3 pans of lasagna and left them at Martha's clinic with a note that simply read, "For the girl and the dog." Even Harold Jenkins, who once declared that fighting dogs should never see the light of day, offered to help repair the kennel fencing. "It ain't about the dog," he muttered. "It's about the kid. You don't carry a wounded animal that far if your heart's not straight." Frank watched it unfold like someone standing in the shallow water of a wide, slow river. The current was moving. He just had to let go of the rocks. One morning, as sunlight streamed through the clinic windows, Sophie stood in the exam room with Rex at her side. A woman knelt in front of her, Agent Parker, dressed now in jeans and a soft blue sweater, not a badge in sight. "I brought something," Parker said. She opened a folder and handed Sophie a framed document, Rex's adoption certificate. Signed, sealed, witnessed by the federal court. "You mean he's mine?" Sophie asked, eyes wide. Agent Parker smiled. "Officially." Sophie looked down at Rex, who sat quietly at her feet, tail thumping once against the floor. "I told him he was," she said, "but I think he needed it on paper." Later that day, Parker and Frank stood on the clinic porch, watching Sophie throw a ball gently across the fence yard. Rex chased after it, not with the speed of a K9 in his prime, but with the joy of someone who had learned there was more to life than running away. "She saved him," Parker said. Frank nodded. "He saved her, too." "There's more," she added after a beat. "That ring Reed ran. It wasn't just local. We've identified contacts in Idaho, Utah, Oregon. At least 3 other stolen police dogs over the past few years. One of them we found alive. Frank stared. Where? Underground kennel. Same property. A pause. And he's safe now. Recovering. But it was Rex who led us there. Without Sophie's rescue, we might never have gotten that far. Frank didn't speak for a moment. Then he said, almost to himself, Abigail would have moved heaven and earth for that dog. Parker smiled gently. Her daughter did. That night, Sophie sat at the kitchen table, sorting through a stack of envelopes. Letters from all over the country, from children who'd seen her story in the newspaper, from adults who remembered their own childhood dogs, from strangers who believed in second chances. She opened one from a woman in Florida, 82 years old, a retired search and rescue trainer. Your story gave me hope again, it said. Hope that the next generation still knows what it means to care. Sophie looked up at Frank, her eyes shining. Can I write them back? He smiled. Every single one. Riverdale had never been a town of noise. It didn't shout, didn't riot, but now it was waking up to kindness, to justice, to the small, fierce light of a child who had refused to look away. Summer came gently to Riverdale. It didn't burst through the trees or crash against the fields. It arrived on soft winds and long, golden evenings, light that lingered on porch steps and warmed the grass beneath bare feet. After months of shadows and silence, the town began to stretch into the sun again. So did Sophie. So did Rex. By June, the backyard behind Frank Miller's house had changed. The old wood fence had been replaced with a tall, secure one, sturdy enough to keep coyotes out, and Hope, Indiana. A modest obstacle course stood in one corner, built from donated supplies and afternoons of patient work. Weaves made from PVC pipe, a fabric tunnel from a garage sale, a platform for balance and trust. Frank had painted a handmade sign and nailed it to the big oak tree at the back of the yard. Rex's kingdom. And it was not a kingdom of crowns or thrones, but one of gentle work and quiet healing. One where a child's voice rang out again, clear and strong, and a dog once broken by cruelty chased tennis balls with joy in his bones. That morning, Sophie stood at the starting line, a whistle around her neck and a grin on her face. Left tunnel, Rex, she called. The German shepherd, sleek now with health, ears perked forward, darted through the tunnel and emerged with a little flourish at the end, tail wagging, mouth open in a wide, doggy grin. Frank clapped from the porch. You've got him trained better than I ever had Duke, he chuckled. Sophie beamed. He likes the games, but he only listens when you mean it. She tossed the ball. Rex launched after it like a creature reborn. He wasn't perfect. His back leg still caught now and then, a ghost of the fracture that almost took him. Loud noises made him flinch. He didn't like confined spaces, but his eyes were soft, his body loose, and his tail always in motion. He trusted again. And Sophie? She laughed now, not just little smiles, but laughter from the belly, from the place that had once been silent. Inside, Frank poured coffee for 2. Martha Wilson arrived with a folder under one arm and a tin of homemade blueberry muffins in the other. Morning, she said. Thought I'd bring these over before the school board meeting. Frank raised an eyebrow. Don't tell me you're nervous. Not nervous. Just careful, she said, glancing out the window toward the yard. Some people still remember Rex as a fighting dog. Frank nodded. They haven't seen what I've seen. Then today, Martha said softly, they will that afternoon. Sophie stood in front of the Riverdale Elementary School board, a little dress ironed neatly, a page of notes in her trembling hands. Frank and Martha sat behind her, along with Agent Lauren Parker, who had driven in from Helena just for the hearing. I used to not talk, Sophie began, her voice small but clear. After the accident, I couldn't find words anymore, not even in my head. She paused, looking down at the paper. Then I found Rex. He was hurt, worse than me, but he didn't bite. He didn't growl. He let me help. She looked up, her chin steady. Now he helps me. The board watched in silence. I think he could help other kids too. Ones who are scared. Ones who don't have words yet. He understands. She stepped back. Rex stood beside her, wearing a blue service vest with a patch that read, "Therapy Dog in Training." He didn't bark, didn't move, just stood beside his girl. Like always, the board approved the program, unanimously. By fall, Rex would begin visiting classrooms once a week, helping children with anxiety, reading struggles, or just loneliness. Sophie would be part of the program too, a helper, a bridge, a quiet guide. One teacher later called it the bravest proposal I've ever seen. Back at home, Sophie curled on the porch swing beside Frank, a letter in her hand and Rex's head on her lap. It was from a boy in Oregon, age 9. His dog had died the year before. He hadn't cried until he read Sophie's story in the newspaper. He'd drawn a picture of Rex with wings and wrote, "I think your dog is magic." Sophie smiled. "He kind of is," she whispered. Frank looked at her. "Your mom would have been proud, you know." Sophie nodded, tears welling but not falling. She reached into her backpack and pulled out Abigail's notebook, the one the FBI had found behind Reed's false wall. Sophie had asked for it, said she wanted to finish what her mother started. Inside were articles, headlines, handwritten thoughts. And in the margin of one page, Abigail had written, "When no one speaks, the dogs suffer, the girl suffers. We all do." Sophie ran her fingers over the words and said, "Not anymore." Later that week, as twilight settled over the town like a soft quilt, Sophie and Rex played fetch in the yard. Fireflies blinked in the grass. The sky blushed with indigo and silver. Frank sat on the steps, coffee in hand, watching them. The girl who once couldn't speak now gave hand signals like a seasoned handler. The dog who once knew only pain now leapt into the air for joy. Frank didn't need big words or long speeches to understand what he was seeing. This was redemption. Not loud, not flashy, but rooted and real. At bedtime, Sophie tucked Buddy the stuffed dog beside her pillow, then knelt beside Rex's crate. "You're my best friend," she whispered. Rex looked at her with amber eyes that held lifetimes. She rested her forehead against his and breathed in the smell of warm fur and safety. Then she whispered, "I think I found my voice because you never gave up on me." His tail thumped once against the crate floor, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Sophie fell asleep without fear. Outside, the wind was soft. No sirens, no shouts, just the quiet breathing of a town that had remembered how to care. And that is how a wounded dog became a guardian, how a broken girl became a voice, and how a small town once blind remembered to see. They didn't rescue each other to survive. They rescued each other to become whole. If you made it here, then you know this was never just about a dog or a girl. It was about the fight for tenderness in a world that too often forgets how to be kind. At Hero Paws, we believe stories like these deserve to be seen, remembered, and passed on because they carry the wisdom of generations. Like the old saying goes, character is how you treat those who can do nothing for you. Sophie didn't carry Rex because she was told to. She did it because something in her, something her mother taught her, knew that when we lift the broken, we rise too. And Rex? He didn't trust because someone trained him to. He trusted because someone saw him, not as a thing, but as someone worth saving. If this story moved you, leave a comment. Let Sophie and Rex's journey echo a little further. Subscribe to Hero Paws to support stories that heal. Your presence here is the heartbeat that keeps this channel going. And remember, saving one animal won't change the world, but for that one animal, their whole world will change. Thank you for being here. Stay kind. Stay brave. We'll see you in the next story.